Hello everyone. This is week 3. In week 3 we're going to be going over chapter 4 and chapter 9. Chapter 4 is on intellectual disabilities and chapter 9 is on deafness and hearing loss. We'll be going over in class, we'll be going over a Vineland activity ID. We'll discuss different strategies and go over the assignment that you have on strategies for students identified with ID. And then you'll have a discussion on 4 and 9, and then you'll have a quiz on chapter 4 and 9. We'll also discuss that there's the lesson plan that we discussed primarily in the first week, but we'll go over it also to make sure that you're ready to go to turn that in also. Go ahead and get started. For chapter 4, make sure that you read the chapter and then go over the PowerPoint that I provided in the week 3 module. And then we'll go ahead and go over standards and indicators for ID and DESI, and then we'll discuss the ID assignment and a little bit more there in class on Tuesday. Anyway, let's go ahead. Right now it's Sunday morning, and first of all, normally what I'll do is discuss a little bit of what I've seen so far in the last week. And I realize a lot of you are on spring break and having some probably some different plans over the week. It looks like about half the class has done well as far as getting discussion board. I don't see that anybody as of this time has taken the online test over 1, 2, and 3. So please make sure and get that done if you're listening to this early and get that taken care of here. Discussion board wise, many of the students were able to get on and do their discussion boards in their initial post fairly soon, Wednesday or Thursday, and then they have also by now given their feedback on their first feedback. As soon as others get on, they will go ahead and do their second feedback, and then I will grade this on Monday morning and get those done. So anyway, let's go ahead and get on to my notes in chapter 4. First of all, going over some of the chapter questions, and in the past gave some difficulties. So which of the following exemplifies learned helplessness? And the one that was the correct answer on that one is Darla has studied for a spelling test, but she refuses to write any of the words the teacher dictates as she fears making an error. And that was on page 116. It wasn't, counts on her fingers because she does not know the answer. It wasn't Brenda asking for help when she does not understand the problem. And it wasn't Aiden listens to the teacher as she gives directions. There was also another question. Which question is critical for the teachers in determining which skills to include in a functional curriculum? And it talks about, will failure to learn the knowledge or skill result in negative consequences on page 127. So you need to look on 127 for that. There are also, what are some important considerations and questions for a teacher when developing a functional curriculum? First of all, will the knowledge and skills lead to independence? That's primarily what you're going to be looking at when you're looking at a functional curriculum. Will the content meet future needs, whether it be employment or independent living or other items that student may need to know? Consider parents' input. Do they think the content is important to meet current and future needs? And then consider the student's input. Does the student think the content is important to meet content and meet current and future needs? And will the student need these skills when they reach the age of 21? And then also, what will happen if the student does not learn this content that you're talking about? Which of the following is a maternal screening test administered during weeks 8 to 10 that can identify pregnancies at risk for a disorder associated with ID? And that's chronic villi sampling, page 124. Let's talk about some of the objectives that I'd like for you to meet during this chapter. List 3 criteria necessary to qualify for special ed services under the IDEA category of intellectual disabilities. Identify which widely used instruments for assessing intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior and state important issues to consider when interpreting and using the results of such tests, and describe common characteristics of students with intellectual disabilities and explain how these characteristics are relevant to planning and delivering instructions. I would like for you to watch the teaching students with cognitive impairments at this time. So go ahead and pause my video and go ahead and click the link on your My Notes Chapter 4, Teaching Students with Cognitive Disabilities or Impairments. So if you will, go ahead and pause, and I'll wait for you to come back. All right. First of all, I want you to think back to what you talked about and what you've thought about so far of inclusion. When we're looking at students with ID, I think you have to look past the normal thought process when you're thinking about students in the classroom, and you might be thinking about academics. You know, can they do the academics that you're wanting your students to do if you are the regular education teacher, or maybe the specials teacher, music, PE, or art, those types of classes. And I think I hope anyway, as you watched the video and as you came to the end and listened to what the parents thought about, you realize that it's much more to inclusion than academics. There's the social concept, and also just the self-worth or the value of the student about themselves when being in a classroom, and how much they will learn and be able to value as they look back into your inclusion part in the student's academic life. Chapter objectives, again, a couple more. Identify factors that might account for the wide differences in the prevalence of ID. Describe key elements of instruction for teaching academic, functional, and self-determination skills. This is one of the critical pieces. And then identify factors that should guide planning and placement decisions for individuals with intellectual disability. And I think this is key for the IEP team, is to really look at what the students' needs are and what their weaknesses are and what their strengths are, and then be able to look together to find out that perfect picture, that perfect IEP for the student at that point in time. Then let's go to the next one, IDEA. And these are the 3 criteria for diagnosis that a student must meet for IDEA. Significantly sub-average intellectual functioning is a score of 2 or more standard deviations below the mean on a standardized intelligence test. So that's where the IQ tests come into play. You know, looking and seeing what that test shows about that student at that point in time. An individual must also have significant delay with tasks of everyday living or adaptive behavior. So you're looking at those skills, those developmental skills that student, that child is working on at that point in time. The deficits must occur during the developmental period to help distinguish intellectual disabilities from other disabilities. So that's the other key component, is this has to happen during that developmental stage, that developmental period, in order to have the IDEA definition of ID. Then there's the AAIDD definition. Intellectual disability is characterized by significant limitations in both intellectual functioning, and that was also in the IDEA, and adaptive behavior as expressed in conceptual, social, and practical adaptive skills. And this one here, the difference is it doesn't have to happen in that developmental stage. In this, the AAIDD definition, the disability originates before the age of 18. So that's kind of the key difference in there, is the age difference. The rest of it is pretty similar. 5 assumptions of the AAIDD definition. Limitations in present functioning must be considered within the context of community environments typical of the individual's age, peers, and culture. And valid assessment considers cultural and linguistic diversity as well as differences in communication, sensory motor, and behavioral. So you also need to look at where the child came from. That cultural and linguistic diversity is a key factor in here to determining if you're looking at a DD definition. Within the individual, limitations often coexist with strengths. The purpose of describing limitations is to develop a profile of needed supports, And with appropriate personalized supports over a sustained period, the life functioning of the person with ID generally will improve. So over time, they will improve their skills by watching, by mimicking, by learning, and by many other factors go into play. Supports are defined as resources and strategies that aim to promote the development, education, interest, and personal well-being of a person that enhance individual functioning. I want you to look at the next slide. It gives you more details as far as where the IQ, what the IQ test can tell you, and where they are on that scale. There are actually 4 different classifications of ID. There's mild, which is 50 to 55 IQ, up to about a 70 IQ. There's also moderate, which is 35 to 40 IQ to 50 to 55. There's severe, which is 20 to 25 IQ to 35 to 40 IQ. And then there's profound, which is below 20 to 25 IQ. Generally speaking, in the state of Missouri, you're going to see students in that profound and possibly a few of the severe that are going to be in what we would call the state schools. At least in the town of Warrensburg, we send ours over to Rolling Meadows over in Higginsville. There's also one in Sedalia, and there's a few more around the state. That districts, if they feel like they need to be sent to a state school where they have a little more help in working with students with ID of those severe and profound areas, they can work on getting that done through DESE, and there's a application process to make that happen. Identification of assessments. You've got standardized IQ tests used to assess intelligence. That's normally administered by a school psychologist or other trained professional. I know in Warrensburg School District they have a person that does all of their IQs. That way they can show a little validity throughout all of the different students, and that's one person that handles that. And then when it gets to the academic testing, there may be others that may be asked to take that, whether it's a teacher, special education teacher might administer some of those. And then they also, parents and teachers will be asked to go through some of the other tests associated with ID and some of the other categories we'll discuss later in the semester. IQ is a hypothetical construct. On that day in time, that is what that student did. It measures only how a child performs at that point in time. IQ tests can also be known to be culturally biased, so you also want to take that into consideration as you're going through these IQ tests. If you're working with a student that may not be, may have a different cultural background than what your students would have in your area. IQ scores can change significantly over time. From pre-K up to about 5th grade, they can change quite a bit. It's my understanding and psychological examiners that normally by 5th grade they do start to become pretty stable, and so by 5th grade that they are pretty much similar to what they might be in the high school. However, I still recommend those in high school to go ahead and get an IQ test given. Do a new reevaluation with testing in that high school age group, especially junior and senior, for those that are going on to post-secondary colleges or programs that will need those. An IQ score should never be used as a sole basis for making decisions regarding special education services. There needs to be the whole gamut of evaluations and testing done before you make a decision on whether that student is ID or not. You want to make sure and get that right. Assessing adaptive behavior. Adaptive behavior is a collection of conceptual, social, and practical skills that have been learned by people in order to function in everyday lives. They're critical in determining the supports a student requires for success at school, work, community, and home environments. These can be typical skills like brushing your teeth, putting on your clothes, tying shoes, buttoning coats, pulling up a zipper, doing chores around the house. As you get older, you're thinking back to your own childhood, as you got older, you got more and more chores, which means you learned more and more skills during that time. And that's pretty much what we're talking about when we're talking about adaptive behavior. Measurement of adaptive behavior has proven difficult because of the relative nature of social adjustment and competence. Students do learn at a different rate, and that's why it's good to know, their past history and also where they're at now compared to their peers. But that, again, that's not the only thing you want to look at, because students do learn at different rates. Conceptual using language for speaking, reading, writing, using number concepts are part of the adaptive behavior. Socially, getting along with others, being a responsible group member, solving social problems, following rules and obeying laws, and avoiding being victimized are also part of that adaptive behavior. Practical skills, you've got the daily living activities such as dressing, toileting, food preparation, etc. are also included in that. What I'd like for you to do is, I know you're doing this online, but think about these two questions. Why has prevention of mental retardation proven so difficult? And now that would be, why is prevention of ID proven so difficult? Also, what are the most important features of effective instruction for students with ID, or the old classification of MR? Think about that. Write down some thoughts. Take a few minutes. Press pause with this, and take a few minutes to see what you can think about those two areas. I want to talk about these. Great progress has been made in identifying the cause of ID. Likewise, great advances in preventative medicine have occurred that help identify those of high-risk pregnancies. In addition, approximately 50% of students identified with ID fall within that mild range, that 55 to 70. Evidence suggests their disabilities can be traced to factors in the environment, such as low levels of social engagement, child abuse, and neglect. Much more needs to be done to provide parents of children at risk for ID and training. There's also 6 features to effective teaching. That would be the next step. Precise definition and task analysis of the new skill to be learned. Direct and frequent measurement of a student's performance. Frequent opportunities for active student responding. And immediate and systematic feedback. Many times students that are ID, you need to be right on top of the things that they're doing as they're learning a skill, or maybe it's a behavior that's happened. You need to be pretty immediate when you're giving that feedback, because they will not remember over a longer period of time what they did or what you're even talking about as it pertains to a certain activity or a certain behavior that you wanted to correct. So it needs to be immediate. Procedures for achieving the transfer of stimulus control from instructional cues or prompts to naturally occurring stimuli, and strategies for promoting the generalization and maintenance of newly learned skills to different non-training situation environments. Many times what that means is they may be able to do something at home quite well, but at school they just can't seem to do that. Or it may be the other way. You might be able to get them to do something at school, and then they go home and they can't transfer that same skill to another environment. And that's why there's times when parents may see things differently, because they can do that at home. Well, in that environment they might be able to, but it's also the same thing can happen from the school environment. You might be able to do it at school, and then they go home and they cannot do it at home. So just some things to think about. The characteristics of ID: cognitive functioning and learning includes memory, learning rate, attention, generalization and maintenance, and motivation. And then the adaptive behavior part: self-care and daily living skills, social relationships, and then you also have behavior excesses and challenging behaviors along with positive attributes. And those in red you definitely want to go and look at and make sure you know before you get on to the quiz portion of Chapter 4. Looking at the prevalence, back in 2012, 6.7% of all school-age children had ID ages 3 to 21. It was the 5th largest disability category, and prevalence rates vary greatly from state to state, as there are some minor differences in how they are identified in different states. More than 350 risk factors are associated with ID. 35% of cases have a genetic cause. Another third of cases involve external trauma or toxin, and then etiology remains unknown for the other third of causes. And that, those factors might be prenatal, perinatal, or postnatal, as far as, in the birth process, as far as that part too. There are some biomedical causes like Down syndrome and Fragile X syndrome. There's also environmental causes. 85 to 90% of people with ID have mild intellectual disabilities. Most show no prevalence of organic pathogy and psychosocial disadvantage or poverty as a factor. On the prevention, the single biggest preventive strike against ID was the development of the rubella vaccine back in 1962. And then there's also some other advances in medical science that have enabled doctors to identify certain genetic influences. So if you look down through those, there's ultrasound, there's maternal serum screening, there's amniocentesis, there's chronic villi sampling, genetic counseling, and then mandatory newborn screening for inherited and biomedical risk factors are involved in that also. The curriculum goals for students that have ID. Academic curriculum, the content basics of math, reading, and writing. The functional curriculum is also a critical piece. Content to increase students' independence, self-direction, and enjoyment in school, home, community, and work need to be looked at. And also self-determination. The content to help a student set goals, plan and implement a course of action, and evaluate their performance. Just because a student has ID and may not have the mental capacities, the IQ of others in school, they too should have a choice. And that's one of the biggest things I can give you right now, is make sure that your student with ID that you may have in your regular ed or special ed classrooms have choices. They need to have those same choices in order to make decisions, and some of those decisions may not be the best decisions, but you can then have a learning experience over those types of decisions. Instructional methods, there are task analysis, where you break down those larger things into smaller, more easily tasked and more easily understood parts. There's active student response, a detectable lesson-specific response. There's transfer of stimulus control, which is gradually and systematically withdrawing some of those prompts. So you may start out with a lot of prompts, but then over time you try to diminish the amount of prompts that you are having to give, or cues. Direct and frequent measurement, objective and frequent recording of the performance of the behavior so they can see, and you can see also, what they're doing. The systematic feedback we discussed a little bit earlier. Information provided to students about their performance. Praise. Make sure and give them praise when they do things right. If you look back at the video that you saw at the beginning of this PowerPoint, you saw that not only from the teacher but also from their peers, which can mean an awful lot to any student, but especially those students with ID. There's positive reinforcement. And then there's instructive feedback. The acquisition stage of learning and the practice stage of learning are involved in this section. There's generalization and maintenance that are other instructional methods. This is the use of what is learned across settings over time. The strategies that are involved are teaching the full range of stimulus conditions, making the instructional setting similar to the generalized setting, and then maximizing content with naturally occurring contingencies and reinforcement. Placement options, and this is one of the most critical ones, and I hope that you remember back to that video about the fact of being placed and included in a regular ed classroom. During the 2012-2013 school year, 17% of students were educated in the general education classroom. 27% were served in the resource room programs. Those would be in the school setting, in the district settings. Only 7% of students with intellectual disabilities are educated in a separate school, residential facilities, or home hospital environments, and those would include, the state schools that Missouri has would be included in that separate school facility. So those are the different placement options, and I would highly suggest you look from the top down first. You go from the least restrictive environment, the regular education setting first. then maybe pulling out for a few minutes out of the day or a few hours out of the day to go into a resource setting to get more academic and social and adaptive functioning instruction. And then if that doesn't work, then go down to the more secluded setting, the section where they're served in those separate classes and they're for all of their content in those classes. And then the very last one, in the state of Missouri, it can only be like 1% of your population of your school setting, or 4%, somewhere in there. It's not a very high percentage of those students that will go into the state school program. And then in addition to that, there's only like 1% or less that are included of your population in those district-run schools into MAP A type situations. So most of those students that are even in the more functional classes will still be needing to take the MAP and the EOCs as part of their education process. Acceptance and membership. Normalization, the use of progressively more normal settings and procedures to establish and maintain personal behaviors which are culturally normal as possible. Social role valorization. People's welfare depends on the social roles they occupy. And also self-determination. Self-educators can help students with intellectual disabilities identify their goals and provide the instruction and supports that will enable them to pursue these goals. Now these goals, classrooms that are more functional in nature, you should see that they are taking them out and they are getting them to learn about those daily and independent living skills. Those might be actually going to a grocery store and picking up purchases for what they're going to make in class, so that then they can understand the buying of those items and understand money, that they can understand a little bit of getting change and taking change. Now, many times these individuals will need more assistance with that, but these are skills that need to be repeated. It might include going to the local library or being involved in a park and rec situation where they go to certain activities at nights or in the weekend. Now, while the schools may not be directly involved with getting the students there, they should be indirectly involved in helping the family understand what other activities in their area and also what other agencies in their area can help assist the student, not only the student, but also the family. Because as you learn from the family portion in Chapter 3 and some in Chapter 2, there are a lot of other factors that come into play when you're a family that has any disability, but especially those that have an ID disability, where they're having to have more 24-hour care. There may be a lot more doctor's appointments involved with some of these students, and to make sure that the family is getting the resources they need also and continue to need throughout their schooling. So those are those items there. So let's see here. I've discussed what you need to do for this week in Chapter 4. Discuss the PowerPoint. Now let's go over the standards and indicators for ID. So let me go back here on Blackboard. Okay. Sorry, my internet is being a little slow, so bear with me. If you're at your computer, go and type in DESE, and you'll find the Missouri DESE website. And then I would look up standards and indicators in the search bar, and you'll get some different choices. And then you'll want to look at the ID part of this, which is eligibility criteria for ID. And this is what schools have to show and have to understand for any student that they are putting in an ID setting. Name a cognitive measure moved. You have to have that cognitive assessment. The score obtained for the child. And then a statement that the score is equal to or below 2 standard deviations from the mean for which that measure is valid when considering age, ethnic, and cultural background. So that's going to be, generally speaking, below that 70 standard score on that IQ. The score obtained will vary depending on the instrument on that one there. Then 1000.20, documentation of adaptive behavior that includes the name of the adaptive behavior scale administered, the results of that evaluation, and the overall score on measured adaptive behavior is consistent with cognitive abilities. So you should be looking at cognitive abilities around or equal to their standard score. And you'll notice here it says and. In some of these eligibility criteria or standards and indicators, you will see an and or, but this one does say and. And it's 1000.3. Reduced cognitive ability and adaptive behavior adversely affects educational performance. And I will say this repeatedly through the class, but it has to affect adversely education performance. And you'll see many of these on many of the classifications we'll discuss over this chapter. So results from formal and informal assessments in achievement in other areas of functioning, such as communication skills and social skill development, indicate the following. A is reduced cognitive abilities and adaptive behavior adversely affect educational performance. So you'll be looking at the scores that they're getting on their classwork and things like that. And then B, specific areas of impact are described. So the team will need to describe what areas in the school setting are impacted by this eligibility into the ID category. So this is the standards and indicators for ID on that one there. So go ahead, go on to the at this point, go ahead and go take your quiz if you think you're ready for that. Get your discussion board taken care of. And then in class on Tuesday, we'll discuss the ID assignment, a Vineland activity, so you get a little more idea of what an adaptive behavior test looks like. And then strategy for teaching ID, and we'll also discuss the AT assignment, that's for Chapter 9, and then the lesson plan that is due at the end of this week. So anyway, have a good weekend. Chapter 9, I will say, I've reviewed, but don't worry about the dates on there. It is taken from my